Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. My name is Ali Al-Sayed, Vice President of Internal Communications and Employee Engagement at EDNOC Group. This interview is part of the virtual Majlis series brought to you by EDNOC Insights and supports of Volunteer.ae. Understanding systemic risk in a post-COVID era is the theme of my conversation with Ian Brimmer, President and founder of EuroAsia Group, a leading global political risk research and consulting firm. Mr. Brimmer, thank you very much for joining me for this virtual conversation.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
Let's start with our first question. There's no doubt that we live in an unusual and unsettling times. Restrictions of movements of people, goods and services, and containment measures, such as the shutdown of business travel and tourism, all possess big questions for what will happen next with our global economy. In this fragile economic environment, what do you believe to be the key global risks facing our world in both the short and near term?
The biggest structural risk is that globalization itself is changing trajectory. I mean, almost every good piece of news that we've experienced over the last generations has come in some way because goods, services, people, ideas, and data have moved faster and faster across borders all over the world. And that's now changing. Obviously, with the quarantine, when with people all over the world locked down for a period of time, there's not a lot of globalization going on. But as we come out of the other end, we're going to see a lot of change in the global supply chain. We're going to see the US-China relationship become considerably less interdependent, most importantly around big data and 5G and the Internet of Things, but also around critical goods and services and labor. And as countries are trying to ensure that their companies are bailed out, but they also have very high unemployment, they'll put conditions that'll require capital and jobs to come back to their country. All of that leads to more localization as opposed to globalization. And we know, number one, that that's going to lead to less growth, less efficiency, a just-in-case as opposed to a just-in-time supply chain. But we also know it can create more conflict because the United States and China are the world's two largest economies. They don't trust each other. That's not new. But at least there was an extraordinary amount of interdependence between the two economies that meant that we were rooting each other's success. Because if China failed, we would fail. If we failed, China would fail. Well, increasingly, when you undo a great deal of the interdependence between the two largest economies, the boundaries that stop you from engaging in conflict become much weaker. And we are right now heading towards a new Cold War. I wouldn't predict we're going to be in one yet, but that's the trajectory. And certainly a world where the two largest economies are fighting each other, as opposed to are working more or less harmoniously to build a global economy, rowing in the same direction, even if they don't see eye to eye, that's a much more dangerous world too.
These are some concerning comments, Mr. Bremer. And I remember at Davos this year in January, you discussed this notion of peak globalization. What are your thoughts on the same subject now, having experienced COVID?
In Davos, we already saw that in terms of the world's technology companies, it was no longer about a World Wide Web. Instead, there were two countries in the world that had dominant tech companies, the United States and China, and no one else was close, but they weren't working together. So despite what I just said about all the interdependence, if you looked at a company like Facebook or Amazon or Google, some of the biggest, most successful companies in the US and the world, they did not have access to the Chinese market. And that was leading to a splintering of the World Wide Web, where depending on whether you lived in China or were using Chinese technology, or you lived in the West, broadly speaking, would determine which of those systems, which of those filters you were using, who was getting your data. And of course, that's monetizable. Well, what we now see in the coronavirus environment is that is becoming much deeper and much broader. And it's not just about China and the United States, but it's also about other countries all around the world, including in the Gulf region, having to make decisions about which system they're going to align themselves with. I mean, if you look at Belt and Road, if the Chinese build a port, Or they build a railroad. Okay, maybe as an American, I'd rather if the Americans built that. But it doesn't matter who builds it because everyone can use it, right? And that makes for a wealthier country. It leads to more development. But if you have to choose which tech system you're going to use, everyone can't use it. Everyone doesn't benefit from that data. And that's very different than the way we created the global internet.
Thank you, Ian, for sharing with me and the audience your insightful thoughts. Stay tuned on Virtual Majlis for the second part of this interview.